And this is Interface, back with you on SABC 3 in our new time slot. Good evening to you and a very warm welcome. My name is Tembisa Magele. This week, South Africans woke up to the news that President Jacob Zuma has proposed paying back some of the money spent on his Nkandla homestead. Opposition parties are not impressed and they are still going ahead with their respective court cases this week on the Nkandla matter. It will now be for the Constitutional Court to decide on Tuesday if the president's offer is appropriate or not. We will be joined very shortly to discuss this by Professor Somadoda Fikeni, who is a political analyst. But before we delve deeper into this discussion, let's take a quick look at this insert compiled by SABC reporter Aldrin Sampier.
A showdown is looming. Thousands of EFF members and supporters are expected to march on Constitutional Hill on Tuesday. This while the Constitutional Court judges hear arguments in the Nkandla matter.
This is not a case between Zuma and the EFF. This is a case to reaffirm the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa and to protect Chapter 9 institutions.
The party wants the judges to reaffirm the powers of the public protector and enforce the implementation of the remedial action. It also wants the National Assembly Speaker to be held liable for failing to get the President to account for breaching the Executive Code of Conduct, as per the Public Protector's findings.
He must agree that he was in breach of oath of office because in everything else he didn't protect the public purse, something that is expected from the sitting president.
A remark the President's legal team refuted.
There has been no adverse finding made by the public protector that renders the president culpable on any matter.
The EFF dismissed claims set in the presidency's statement that the offer to pay back the money was made in November already. Aldrin Sampier for Interface.
So as always on the program, we welcome your thoughts throughout, and you can find us on Facebook at Interface on SABC or on Twitter at Interface on SABC or at Tembisa Magele. Dr. Fikeni, thank you very much for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tembisa.
So why do you think the president suddenly made this announcement that he's willing to pay back some of the money?
Well, I do think that it's a calculated move, having studied the terrain and the prospects of success on a number of grounds. The first one, the Constitutional Court, which is the penultimate court in the land,
right,
was going to sit and make a determination as to whether the public protector's recommendations can simply be tossed out. Having had a precedent where the Supreme Court of Appeal had ruled on the SABC matter to say you cannot ignore those particular findings and remedial actions proposed unless you present something similar or superior, rather than simply say there is no case. So that was the first one to say, should I lose there and be forced, then it is more of a blow. The second one, I'm almost certain that the question of local government elections coming very soon was very much important in this consideration, because ANC had a rough time in 2014, having difficulty to reflect on their manifesto, because all the time the opponents were raising the issue of Nkandla, and some people on the ground were raising the issue of Nkandla. And some of the people who were opponents of the e-toll saying that we can't pay for something that we did not, participate in or were consulted on.
Prof, let's split the two. Let's look at the first part of your answer. The fact that maybe he was trying to avoid taking this case to the Court. But now opposition parties have said they're still going ahead. So what does that say then, or what does that mean for him having tried?
I do think that his intervention and answer was not comprehensive. Because remember, the point the opposition parties, EFF, DA and others, were raising were the powers of the public protector. That's what is going to be tested there. Even if one were to say, I offer to pay, it would have been unlikely that they would suddenly retreat. Precisely because the issue of the powers of the public protector have been raised again and again, and the president himself has entered the fray by saying those are recommendations, and that came up in case of Parliament as well. And that in itself, I think, has been one of the key issues that they want to prove, that the Chapter 9 institution might have been put in a difficult position, even in terms of resources and so forth. Remember, they want to make sure that they affirm the powers of the public protector more than just the payment.
So on that one leg, would this have been a futile exercise then on his part?
Not futile in a sense, because in this case, the Constitutional Court would have said, go back to the drawing board and do make the payments, or even make a determination on some of the areas or the scope of payment and who should make that determination. Okay. So this simply lessened the pressure and also preemptively said these are the offices that I think will do the work of determining what is to be paid.
Second part of your answer, the elections that are coming up. How does this help or not help the president now that the case is still going to court anyway?
It's a very awkward one. It helps and sometimes it doesn't help.
Okay.
It helps in a sense of saying you can't go to these elections with the cry, pay back the money per se, because they will say that process is underway or the money is being paid on the ground. But it raised some serious issues on the leaders who consistently had been trying to justify, rationalize, and also said the president had no money to pay in this particular case. So it raised a fundamental question for ANC leaders in particular to say, over time, it's safer to protect the principles and the values of the organization and focus on that, rather than to protect leaders, even when you feel sometimes that it's a gray area. Because in this particular case, leaders and their choices do change, but principles are rather consistent and defendable over time. So in this particular case, I think they deployed so much in trying to protect the leader to a point where now, when the situation changes as it does, it sort of raised a reputation risk on their part.
What do you make of the theory that they say that the president has changed his mind on this matter simply because there's a new senior counsel on his team that is telling him that he's going to lose anyway should this matter go to court?
If your senior counsel tells you that you're going to lose, and on the basis of that risk you change, it's not a change of heart or mind. It's a calculation that I'm going to lose. So it's more of a tactical move rather than a sudden change, because we've listened to the president in the interviews, which I think was a mistake. If he said I was not involved in this, he ought to have allowed all other people to argue the case. But from time to time, he entered the fray to say, why should I pay? I was not involved and so forth. And that, I think, on the part of him and the advisors was a mistake.
All right, we have to take a short break. Remember, we are taking your thoughts as per usual at Interface on SABC. That's how you find us on Facebook and also on Twitter at Interface on SABC or at Tembisa Magele. To stay with us. So tonight on Interface, we're talking about the president's proposal to pay back at least some of the money that has been spent on upgrades on his Nkandla homestead. And we are asking the question, is the president, through his proposal, admitting that he unduly benefited from Nkandla upgrades? If you would like to give us your thoughts on that one, to find us on Facebook and on Twitter. And also we are chatting to Professor Somadoda Fikeni, who is a political analyst. Prof, before the break, we were talking about what could have persuaded the president to go this route. We heard in the clip earlier that the opposition party, the EFF in particular, says they're still going to have these disruptions come SONA, and they're still going to go ahead with a court case. What do you read into that?
Remember, when they see that the president looks vulnerable from the Nene situation and Van Rooyen appointment, which had to be retrieved, they'll go for broke. And I've always said that the situation between President Zuma and Julius Malema is more than just ideological, political. It's personal grudges that have to be settled. Malema is convinced that his challenges with SARS and many others are driven by a big machination, and he's convinced that his expulsion from the ANC was engineered by President Zuma or some senior leaders. So it's no longer just a matter of policy or principle. Of course, it will be articulated in that manner. So if they see him vulnerable, elections are close by, they go for broke.
But are these personal gripes, as you describe them, are they happening and being settled at our expense as the taxpayers and the citizens of South Africa?
It has always been. If you see the Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, where literally those challenges have never been settled. Here are capable individuals. And at times, some of their policy positions, like African Renaissance, which is still championed everywhere in the continent, had to be damped somewhat because the chemistry, the personalities had become so strong. In fact, in the South African politics today, the greatest challenge we face is the personalization of politics, which has weakened the institutions. Politics now are about who are you standing with, hence the factions. What had happened before, it's very little to do with ideologies, with policies. Of course, in the articulation, leaders will present ideologies, but behind the scenes, it's all personal in the main.
But what do we do about that as the citizens of South Africa? I mean, what do we do when, as you say, these battles are being fought in our name, but they are being fought at our disadvantage?
I do think that South Africa made a fundamental mistake in the early 90s when the mass democratic movement, the social movements, were abandoned, because the hope was that either the ruling party or the political parties and the constitution would do the bidding for us. So citizens ought to go back into active citizenship in their communities, in their municipalities, in their provinces and so forth, and claim that space, because right now, instead of having a democracy, we have a partocracy. It's all about political parties. No defined national interests.
Yeah.
They would rather forgo national interests. When last did you see all parties, everyone across, coming to say these are the national interests?
But isn't that the nature of politics all over the world, though? You look at what's happening in the US, you look at what's happening in the UK, and in other countries on the African continent. That's what they do, isn't it?
But very often, many countries define their national interests.
Okay.
They define their national security. They define their national interests. They fight about everything else. When it comes to the national interests, even the US, Democrats and Republicans, when they say now there is something defined as national interest, September 11th,
they set
everything aside. That is awfully lacking in South Africa. Every calculation is about the next election. It's about the party advantage. Hence, now politics is beginning to be affected by that negative perception from the people.
Well, Dr. Fikeni, now that you've thoroughly just depressed us, let's move back to the issue of the Corn Court and what Public Protector Thuli Madonsela said. She said, in reviewing what the President has said, her feelings are that this is a partial acknowledgement or a partial recognition of the power that her office holds and her remedial actions hold. What do you take from that? Is this something she's likely to challenge?
She is being magnanimous, but at the same time, even if her office was to say, now that the payment issue has been dealt with, we are not joining as the friends of the court. She still knows that the parties going ahead, the Constitutional Court will still have to make a determination about the powers of the Public Protector. And then if she wins in a sense of being vindicated on the very last year of her term, that becomes rather a very high note on which you step off, you know, because the hassle in the last few years, which had become so acrimonious, has been to say, has she overstepped her boundaries or not? And if the highest court were to say, no, she had not, then she would take that as a vindication, and even if she leaves the post, she would say, I had always said the same.
I'm keen to hear, what are your thoughts on that? Has she overstepped her mark here?
Well, I don't necessarily think that she has overstepped her mark here. The only area where I think she would have been well advised not to do, one time she appeared in the Democratic Alliance Women's you know, Forum, at the very time when her office was being you know, blamed or questioned, that she ought not to have associated herself closely with the political, because this would become a political football. But most important, though, it's the pattern of cases that she has taken, and others would say they were mainly against government. There was one case that was given to her to say the pre-1994
I'm going to have to
cases.
just ask you to hold that thought. I would like you to finish it right after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are watching Interface here on SABC 3 in our very new time slot, and we're talking about the president's proposal to pay back a portion of the money used on upgrades on his Nkandla homestead, talking to Professor Somadoda Fikeni, and also taking your thoughts on social media. So you can finish that point, Prof.
I was saying that one of the cases which the public generally has not focused on was her investigating the pre-1994 abuses of state power by companies and so forth. That case has not been privileged. And had she taken on that, it's a big one, then she would take on a different kind of interest groups and so forth. But the pattern of cases, since the focus has mainly been on the current government, the perception start being that, oh, you are challenging the current government.
Now, I know we're digressing a bit, but why do you think she did not follow through with that?
She did explain in one of the, you know, SABC interviews, which was quite, you know, strange in saying that if we take this route, it could be risky, the investors and so forth. Hers was not to consider the investors or anything, but to say, I've been given a task, I just have to follow, because you may have class action lawsuits which may be messier than when you simply investigate and say these are the remedial actions.
Okay, so let's say Concord on Tuesday comes back and says, no, the remedial actions of the public protector are binding, therefore you've got to, Mr. President, pay back a portion of the money. Who must now determine how much the president should be paying? Because we had a report from National Treasury, we had the Police Ministry doing something, we also had the Department of Public Works doing something, and we still haven't come to a figure as yet.
Well, I think the Constitutional Court may actually say the Auditor General or the Minister of Finance are fine, or they may add yet another if they suspect that the perception that the executive is under the president anyway. For its
Because that was the
independence.
outcry when they did the reports.
But in this case, the case is very clearer, because it's no longer whether the president pays or not. It's to say what are the issues which are non-security. But now the tricky part, will he have to pay the inflated prices or the actual prices?
Because there was that.
And the second one, will these have an accumulated interest over time? As quantity surveyors would say, 2 years, 3 years ago, this would have been worth this. And ultimately, who is going to pay once you run into all those millions? Because president's salary is not as big to withstand some of the demands. Who is going to show up the hand? And will the showing up the hand be another news headline again.
And in your view, who is best placed to determine all of that?
I think the Auditor General is still fine, and I do think that Treasury could still do the work, but it may just be advisable to have an independent, quantity surveyor or independent financial institution to beef them up, to say this is what has to be done, because, like it or not, this issue has become political. So many departments have been involved. And as such, the last thing you want is to allow it to continue to be a political football.
Let me just ask, speaking of political football, is the president caught between a rock and a hard place here? Because if he says, no, I'm not paying any of the money, he's in trouble. If he says, okay, I'll pay a portion of the money, even if he were to say as determined by the public protector, we would still, as South Africans, as political parties, the opposition in particular, come down on him and say, why did it take you so long to do this? And, get into the intricacies of that. What is the best course of action for the president here?
None. I think whatever action it takes, precisely because of those reasons, but I would go further. The president ought to have just gone to our national television during prime time and say, whilst this is my own... Should have come to Interface. Yes. Whilst this is my own homestead, very early on when Mail and Guardian, City Press and so forth broke the story, I've decided to halt whatever work is being done to investigate if there is validity of these claims. That's one. The second one, he could have just put up a multi-party or an independent commission of retired judges to say, I want you to design laws which will make sure that this kind of abuse is never, ever again a feature. It would have gone a long way to restore all this. But it's water under the bridge now because so many people have been drawn into this. And guess what? The general public there always knew, even before the public protector, what had to be done. They always knew before media and so forth that if there were things which are of not security, concern, president has to just take responsibility and find ways and means. All this theater in the time when people were debating and so forth, the public was simply saying, has this country lost common sense? Because these are commonsensical things. They are not very complicated.
Prof, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time. And we look forward to seeing what's going to come up at SONA and also on Tuesday at the Corn Court. Thank you for coming through.
Thank you for inviting me.
And we leave it there for this evening. Do join us again next week at the same time. Remember, this is our new time slot on SABC 3. From me, Thembi Samakhele and the team. Good night.